Welcome to the Analytical Brand Podcast, a podcast on marketing science, insights, and consumer behavior. Today, we're going to look into how to convince other people and how to convince people about policy and about ideas. And we might learn a couple of facts that we can use in the marketing of services and products as well. So we're going to talk to the wonderfully intellectually offbeat Dr. Sarah Stein and her research on cognitive dissonance and things related to cognitive dissonance, and we'll explain it a bit more, or Sarah will explain a bit what it is. So welcome, Sarah. Happy to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So tell me a little bit what we started with. Cognitive dissonance. What's cognitive dissonance?
Cognitive dissonance is something you probably heard thrown around as an insult on Twitter, but it's actually a quite famous, old, and well-established psychological theory about what happens when human beings notice, even unconsciously, a contradiction between two or more of their own beliefs or actions. And the theory suggests that in certain conditions, when we have a contradiction between two or more of our beliefs or actions, we actually feel uncomfortable, we feel discomfort, and we're driven to try to resolve that contradiction in some way, the same way we would if we were thirsty, and so we go for water, right? You know, we're hungry, etc. And there's a good deal of evidence for this theory. You know, I treat it more or less as fact, although it's a very specific kind of fact, obviously, as all social science is. And what it means, in short, is that when people present us with information that contradicts our existing beliefs, especially when those beliefs affect either our sense of self or our sense of agency, we're very averse to changing those beliefs. And this can help explain why people often hold on to beliefs that are not just not accurate, but also not helpful for them. Like, it can help explain why there might be people who are harmed by policies but keep voting for the people that implement those policies. And that's actually what I did my PhD in.
Oh, incredibly fascinating. And I read your book, and don't talk about politics, and it immediately has politics in the title, although I must say your insights are much broader. It has everything to do with how to convince people, with identity and with values, and that's what I found fascinating. Now, you referenced work that some subjects are easier to convince people on than other subjects. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so what happened when dissonance theory was proposed, it was actually discovered like in a cult setting. Psychologists were looking at people who, were in cults and why they believed things that obviously were not helping them. And it was troubling to psychologists of the time because it contradicted behaviorism. And you all know what behaviorism is because you're a marketing crew, but it contradicted the paradigm of behaviorism because there were many cases where people would not respond to incentives or even punishments, but would instead continue to hold on to the belief and do the things that corresponded to the belief in order to, keep this contradiction compressed, essentially. And therefore, behaviorists were alarmed, and they started trying to disprove dissonance theory. And they did not disprove dissonance theory, but they did help establish some of the conditions for us to feel dissonance. And roughly, two of them seem to be that our sense of self is threatened, especially our sense of ourselves as good people. And the other one is our sense of agency is threatened, or our sense that we, it's a little bit complicated and people argue about it, but basically that we want to believe that if we did cause something, it was good. And if something bad happened, we didn't cause it.
How convenient.
Yeah. And so, and actually, this makes sense to me for lots of reasons, but that can help us untangle some of the naughtier questions of why do people continue to believe this, and how can they believe this even though it just doesn't make any sense? And why is it so difficult to have conversations at the dinner table with people about things when clearly, et cetera, et cetera? Politics is a situation where our sense of agency and our sense of self is threatened, right? If we have to change our political views, it's probably going to imply that something we did in the past was bad in some way, or at least something we supported was bad. And that's part of why political views are incredibly hard to change. In the book, I actually have a lovely graph from one of the studies where they see what things they can change people's minds about, right? Yeah, and it's a beautiful graph, and a little bit confusing because I think they've mislabeled some of the bars, but never mind. They're very nice guys. I interviewed one of them once. One of them is Sam Harris. Actually, I didn't interview him, but that's Sam Harris. In any case, the political topics people really don't change their minds on very much, no matter how much information you present them with. You could give them an infinite amount of information about welfare or, abortion or gay marriage. This was like liberals in America and 10 or 15 years ago or something, but they don't change their mind very much. But you can give them a lot of information about other stuff that doesn't seem political and they'll change their mind. You can tell them new facts about whether early childhood reading predicts intelligence or whether Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and new information in those areas will change their minds a lot. So that's quite an interesting challenge for advertisers because one of the questions they have to face is like, okay, we want to change someone's mind about something, but how closely is this already tied into their sense of identity? How hard is it going to be?
That is so incredibly fascinating what you say here, because This is, I think, what our listeners will find very interesting as well, that there are subjects that are much harder to change upon, and something when it's identity related or policy related of who you are. And then there are subjects that are easier to change about. And this is perhaps where on the other end, it's much easier to change if you're eating a Snickers or a Mars bar. And if you get more information into what stills your hunger better.
Yeah.
Because then that really works. But as soon as it comes closer to who you are, it's more difficult. And that would also imply that some brands are much more difficult to convince people to use, for instance, when it's much more values related. Think of Patagonia, for instance. It also means the other way around, that they have a certain stickiness to their brands with a certain set of audience. So not all, well, and it also suggests the other way around, that if you're targeting everybody, that means that if you are very much policy related, you will chase people away. And can you say also a bit more about Dan Cahan's work on cultural cognition?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I find useful about his work, so he has a bunch of bits of research on how people kind of find ways to to believe the information without believing the argument. Let's put it this way. There are a number of things in his research that are interesting, but in my book, one of the examples he gives is of farmers in the Midwest in America who understand that they are getting less water than they used to, less rain. But they choose also not to believe in climate change, right? Which is very interesting because obviously the first one is the second one. And they just say, you know what, I need drought-resistant seed now. I'm going to go buy some drought-resistant seed. But if you ask them, why do you need drought-resistant seed? They'll say, oh, it's just been a couple of dry years, et cetera, right? They're not bought into what they see as like a larger ideological project coming from like horrible elite somewhere else that doesn't align with their social world. And we'll get into that in a minute because, of course, in my book, I argue that there are these other things that are much more powerful than arguments, right? But in short, what he's saying is that people are pretty comfortable with reasoning in a way that allows them to maintain their social world and their day-to-day actions at the same time. So these farmers are actually doing a really good job. If you think about reasoning not as a tool for discovering the precise truth in a precise way, but as a tool for navigating the world, right? And humans are mostly navigating the world with reason. That's why we have myths. That's why we have stories. That's why we have weird little like delusions that we hold on to about our lives that actually help us in some way get through the day. And he's saying, yeah, most human beings are not reasoning in the way that like a scientific instrument is reasoning. They're reasoning in a way that allows them to correspond with other people, to align, to stay in touch with them, and at the same time to make sure that they, don't starve next like harvest cycle or whatever. And honestly, who can blame us? Except the problem is occasionally we really have to take in some very difficult information instead.
Yes. And how do you convince these people then?
If you were in my movement school, I've run movement school, right? If you were in my movement school, I would say these guys are they're probably not your strategic target. And it's relevant for advertisers also, right?
Yeah.
Most of the time, activists are not looking to convince some guy that is particularly opposed to what they have to say. What you want to do is go find the strategically most important group of people. Those might be policymakers, although these days I find that the people in power do not care at all. And, it might be the people that are on the fence. It might be the people who are in a position to do something like dock workers who can make sure they don't ship arms to Israel, right? It might be whatever. You want to find the strategically useful group of people, and those are almost already not the people who are like these guys, because usually farmers in the Midwest are in a state that they are not going to vote for anything progressive anyway. Not necessarily, right? But you need a strategy. So I would first ask my movement students, hey, who are the right guys? Maybe these are not our guys, But if I wanted to convince these guys, look, I think there's a popular vision which is common in progressive movements and is related to marketing now, which is about messaging. And it says if we just message these people well, we can get to a different understanding. And there is something to this. For example, there's some evidence that if you tell relatively conservative people that we need to preserve the environment rather than going on a big rant about climate change, we need to conserve nature, they're much more open to conserving nature, right? So there's something to be done there. But I think the other thing that's worth suggesting in this case is that you want to create other opportunities for those folks to lead with their actions and their beliefs will follow. This is one of the chapters in my book. We have a kind of folk intuitive idea that you provide people with information, then they change their views. That's not what the data shows. What usually happens, especially when it comes to political and social beliefs, is people's lives change and then their beliefs change. In this case, these farmers are even weirder because something about their life has changed. They need drought-resistant seed. but they haven't changed their belief system yet. However, you can imagine a world where they're given a much more active role to play in climate adaptation, right? And then they can become proud of that, and they can actually like hold on to that as an identity and do it with other people and form relationships around it. At that point, you might begin to kind of create a belief shift where, yeah, there is a real problem and it really is global warming, but we farmers can do something about it. So in a sense, it's an argument for organizing, and all the arguments can come downstream of organizing.
So Sarah, let me rewind it, because you had so many interesting things there in between the lines and nuggets that okay. I need to unpack it a little bit.
Let's try.
First, I really liked what you mentioned, that focus on the ones on the fence. You said it as a small byline, but that's really important. You know, you can focus more on a part of your target audience that is more open than others, that is more willing to change, and you perhaps don't have to focus on the hardcore naysayers, if you want to call it that way. But when it comes to policy, you don't have a choice. You probably need to convince the policymakers, and what you said there is the same as to the way you convince farmers. Or am I wrong in that?
So I think even with policymakers, you always are looking at a specific group of people. It's very rare that you're doing something that is just for everyone. I think it's important both for strategic reasons and also because most of us have this slightly juvenile or slightly, I don't know, almost Freudian instinct that we want to convince the people who have been so unconvincible, and then we'll feel okay again. Or like, I know a lot of my organizing participants, they will say, I really want to convince my uncle that I always have to talk to at Christmas. Your uncle is not the guy, you know? He's not
Yeah. It's funny you should say that, because I'm thinking about my neighbor who I get along very well. We hold backyards, food sessions and barbecues together, and he has a total different political point of view. At every barbecue, I hope to convince him with facts, and it just never works. And I wonder, why can't you see it? And he probably has the same view about me, by the way. If you would talk to me, he would probably say exactly the first thing. That is the thing. So this is also, and also you mentioned framing it in a light that is interesting. For instance, when you say, talking about conserving nature, and you frame it as conserving. In my previous work, we actually looked a lot at value sets. And indeed, this is so true what you say. And for instance, what we've noticed is that all the more conservative groups you can convince by conserving nature by saying it's the duty to tend and inspire that it was given and you have to behold it and take care of it for the next generation. And it's almost a divine step to take. So I totally understand what you say there. But that means that you really have to draw this group of people in. And is that practical? Because that means that trying to convince people is a tough job, because it's very labor and...
It's practical because everything else doesn't work in the long run, right? That's how I feel about it. Like spending a lot of time just framing things differently doesn't work in the long run if you're fighting big political forces who are reactionary, because they don't care about these framings and they're going to slowly mobilize people in the opposite direction until they're radicalized. So you have to do something else. You have to organize against something like that. In a way, my book is an argument that for certain kinds of very big ideas, it is not enough to say anything. It is not enough to have really cool graphics. It's not enough to make a great film. It's not enough to have a social media task force. You have to go out and talk to people in person, bring them into your movement and ask them to do something and make this a huge part of their life. And nothing else will work. Nothing else is a good substitute for that thing, right? So yeah, it is practical. But what you're saying, I think really, and I get this question a lot, is, isn't it hard? And it is hard. It's hard. And you know, to be honest, you and I probably both read a lot of books that are like psychology driven, and they say, hey, I'm going to make your life easy, right? I'm going to teach you how to like do the correct habits, and then you're going to learn how to persuade people with these 3 hot tips, and then maybe you'll, I don't know, get laid or something if you use these lines. Whatever. They're all tips, you know? And this is not a hack book. This is a book about the really hard stuff, and at no point do I suggest it's going to be anything other than hard, but unlike everything else, it might actually work in the long run in the most important areas of our lives. Because I really do think that questions like climate change are the most important areas of our lives. And this is the other thing about it. The upside of organizing is that people who do it are happier, right? And I say this a lot.
Oh, that's so fascinating.
Yeah. Not because I'm like super into happiness research and think it's perfect and wonderful, but because I think right now we're living in an extremely disconnected time where many, many people have no particularly deep or profound source of meaning in their lives because they work a job that was like more or less randomly assigned to them. They're isolated from other people. Those things take meaning away from people. And then you look at this research on activists, right? And on average, in almost every country we can measure this, left-wing people are more unhappy than right-wing people. They just are. And this is true even when you control for lots of variables. So you can control for wealth, and you can control for do they go to church, and you can control for are they married, and blah, blah, blah. Even so, just having left-wing views seems to make you more unhappy unless you are an activist. Then you are happier again. Doing the activism makes you happier. And that's probably true for right-wing activists, by the way, also, because the things that are probably making people happier there is the doing. It's the going out and talking to people and feeling deeply connected to other people and doing something meaningful with your life and having a sense of purpose. There is no substitute for that, you know? So yeah, I think it's practical, but it's practical in like a very big sense of the word practical, not in the small practical sense of, you know, a self-help book.
Okay, good. So if we try to extract it to a higher level,
yeah.
so activism itself makes you happier.
It's the doing. And it seems particularly important that you do something. Well, first of all, the people that seem to screw up their opponents are the most happy, which is kind of fascinating, right? When they're like, I directly made it harder for the people I disagree with to do the bad thing they're going to do. That seems to make people really happy. But also the social connections. Yes, yeah, they're happier because they had meaning and purpose and they had friends. What an amazing thing, you know?
But this would not be specifically left. This is, I would imagine, across the spectrum. That everybody who's an activist fighting for their ideals.
We don't have as much good data on it, but I think that's probably true. But the wound appears to be a little bit deeper on the left, shall we say. Like the thing that has to be repaired.
And what's that?
Because left-wing people are more likely to say the world is completely screwed up the way it is now, right? It's two things, actually. One is lifestyle. Left-wing people tend to choose a lifestyle that is somewhat more correlated with being unhappy. But the other reason is that even if you control for this, it's that left-wing people think that the world is on a path, a very bad path, right? Like they think something is wrong. It's much harder to live in a world where you think something is wrong. It's just, that's hard to get up every day and be like, wow, things are going wrong. But what's interesting is that those sources of meaning and connection and action are enough to repair the unhappiness that seems to be caused by knowing that something is wrong in the world. Knowing something is wrong and not doing anything about it is very bad for you. Knowing something is wrong and doing something puts you back in a pretty good place.
So I think we have to remember that knowing something that's bad for you, if you know it, do something well. You don't do it only for the world, you do it for yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that is
that sucks.
That's the big hook. You know, go out there, grab yourself an idea, grab yourself an ideal or cause, and do something about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Super. And you also mentioned the famous line from the journalist, I think it's Mac Ray, that mentioned all persuasion is self-persuasion. Can you say something about that?
Sure, yeah. So this is my friend David. He's David McRaney. He's
McRaney, yes.
Who writes a book, also a very good book called How Minds Change or something like this. Because, you know, for a very long time, including in David's world, there were a lot of books about why people cannot change their mind at all for any reason politically. It was kind of a mantra. And then David wrote a book about the kind of rare instances where people do change their mind. He looked at like what does work. And it's a very interesting book. I really recommend it. You know, David is also a little bit less actively political than I am. So if you
we haven't noticed.
No, you might enjoy his sort of gentle Southern take on the whole situation. But anyway, nevertheless, he uses this term. I think he draws it from another researcher actually, but he uses it well. And he says, you know, when you learn from all these techniques that actually do work, and by the way, these are long, intensive techniques about having a relationship with another person where they talk to you at length about you and you learn about them. So they're not marketing campaigns. They're much more complicated than that. Those techniques, he says, in all these cases, all persuasion is self-persuasion. And the reason that that's important, firstly, what it means is that when people become convinced of a new idea, at no point do they say, wow, Martin really convinced me. I mean, obviously, this is a phrase people use. But if you look at psychologically what is happening, they've convinced themselves. They have decided that they are, you know, really thinking through things and they are smart enough that actually, you know what, this is a great idea. They get to own the experience and they go through the steps themselves and they have to do the work. And nothing you could say to them until they're ready to do that work is going to be that useful, right? And so, for example, in deep canvassing, one of the techniques that really does work, you spend a lot of time asking the person, okay, how convinced are you from 0 to 10 about X thing? And the person, even if they're not remotely near you, if you're, let's say, at a 10 about, I don't know, trans rights or whatever, you know, the person will say, okay, I'm 1 out of 10. They won't say 0 because 0 is quite extreme. Almost no one says that. And then the question you're supposed to ask them isn't, why aren't you at 10? It's, why aren't you at 0? because that means there's this little bit of doubt, right? And then
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah,
oh,
yeah.
yes, no, and then they begin to give you their reasons why they might be interested in, I don't know, extending trans rights.
Oh, how fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah.
And all persuasion seems to work roughly like that. You want to have a conversation where the other person begins to give you their reasons why they might come to agree with you. And you say, "Oh, fascinating, Martin, tell me more. What do you mean that you think everyone should get to express themselves however they want?" Yes, interesting. And and you're kind of drawing out for them their own reasons why they might come to agree with your position. And that gives people a sense of agency and autonomy that they deeply crave. And like in all the research I look at, one of the things I love about the research I do is that some of the same findings pop up over and over again in different strands of psychology. And one of the main ones is that human beings are incredibly insistent that they want to be in charge of their own lives. They want to have agency and they don't want other people to tell them what to do. And this can be used against them. It can be weaponized against them and force them to believe crazy things. But it's kind of an admirable trait about human beings, in my opinion.
Oh, incredibly interesting. So you have to use David McRae, this quote from All Persuasion, Self-Persuasion, and really make them convince themselves. And you just have to sow the seeds of doubt.
Yeah, when I really want to convince someone, I hang out with them a lot. And whenever like a little thread emerges where they might come to agree with me on something, I say, "Oh, tell me more." I don't go around giving them a million pieces of information. Screw that. They don't want to hear this, and they're probably tired of me. I wait for them to have the moment where they're ready to be like, actually.
Yeah. Well, you sound like an incredibly intelligent, perhaps a little bit dangerous lady there.
This is, you're going to be joining my climate protest any day.
Exactly. Already half persuaded. Now, also, you mentioned deep canvassing, how it works. Can you say a little bit more about the project that Obama used in combination with technology? I think those the big data project.
Relational organizing, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I got to interview the people that did this. So look, Obama's campaigns were...
It's a new data project. I'm sorry, that was it. Yes.
Yeah, the new data project is what they called it at the time. I think it's closed now. Goodness knows the Democrats in America have all so much reckoning to do on so many levels. But in any case, it is true that Obama's two campaigns, especially the first one, really began to understand some of the uses of social relationships in canvassing. So the most traditional form of canvassing that I'm familiar with anyway, is like you just go knock on people's doors and then you ask them, "Hey, Martin, are you going to vote for Fred?" And then, either Martin says yes. And you say, "Oh, wonderful. Do you need to drive to the polls? I'll drive you on the day," whatever, right? That's just a turnout mechanism. Or conceptually, Martin says, "Well, I'm not really sure because I don't like Fred's views on whatever, van permits." And then you say, "Oh, well, let me talk to you about that. And have I told you about all these wonderful things that Fred is doing about healthcare?" And you try to convince the person. The best data we have on just like normal canvassing suggests that at best, it does a little bit of good for turnout. So you never convince the person at the doorstep about Fred, but you might convince him that he needs a ride and then make sure he actually goes. And that's kind of useful, but it's not that useful. It's not that persuasive. Why? Because frankly, who the hell are you? Why would he care what you have to say? You don't have a relationship with him, right? And so one of the many small innovations of the Obama campaign, and some other people have done this too, of course, is that they realize that if the person who's talking to is in fact your friend, suddenly you care a lot more. You are not necessarily brainwashed, by the way. And actually, something I find wonderful is when I read all this data on friendship, friends do not brainwash each other. It's kind of like you're friends with your neighbor, right? But you guys are not convincing each other. But friends do a couple of things. So first of all, in general, our friends are very good at helping us reduce our prejudices against groups. If you have, let's say, I don't know, a Muslim friend, you become less Islamophobic. If your friend isn't Muslim, but he has a Muslim friend, that also makes you less Islamophobic.
Oh, how fascinating.
Yeah. So like just our network of trust basically allows us to let new people into the circle of trust. And that's very important for democracies. The other thing our friends tend to do is they just make us care about politics more, even when we disagree with them. Like in a weird way, the fact that you and your neighbor are talking about politics all the time is kind of good, in my opinion, even though you're never going to convince each other because you're both remembering that politics matters to you. And then also in some cases, friends, again, it's about who you want to convince, right? The most important thing is that our friends tend to pull us a little bit towards values we probably already have. Like I'm rarely persuaded by my friends, but I can be mobilized by them. So they can come to me and say, "Sarah, I know that you care about this, but you haven't really had any time to focus on it right now, but let me take you with me." And that's kind of what relational organizing does. It says, "Hey, I know you're really busy. I'm your friend. This really matters to me. Let's go vote together." And that also is quite an effective turnout tool. And it's generally borne out by all of the best data that we've got on this stuff. Like our friends are our political mobilizers. They say, "We're going to the climate protest. You're coming." What is the number one predictor of whether someone installs a heat pump in their house? It's whether their friend has a heat pump. You literally cannot pay people to install heat pumps enough. You can only get them to do it via their friends, basically, in the studies we've got. That's
How
amazing.
interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
wild, right? But it also makes sense. We're much more interested in what other people in our social world that we care about think of us than we are in like, oh, am I going to get a bunch of cash to install this device I don't understand? It's much more relevant once we have friends who are interested in the same thing.
That's so interesting indeed. And you mentioned to get some numbers out there for, let's say, the amount you can actually convince or change is actually quite small.
Tiny.
But still, it matters. I mean, when we when we talk about 2.4% that the new data project got to change people's opinion, it sounds very small. But if you look at the alternative, which is like knocking on people's doors, 0.8, it's still 3 times as big.
Yeah, it matters
And margins,
sometimes.
yes, yeah, and small margins make a difference, especially in voting. And talk about what works and what doesn't work. You mentioned the demonstrations don't work. Now, I was taken aback by that. As an outsider, I would imagine if you see large demonstrations, that they would work. And also, to keep it on what we see in what's hurting in the news now, people are changing their mind on Gaza. And I always thought it was because of demonstrations, but you actually suggested that it was different.
Yes. So let's talk about protests in general first, and then we can think about Gaza as like a new challenge to understand. So there's a lot of data on protests and what they do. And I think many people's intuition about protest, here we're going to focus on demonstration, right? Because technically like a strike is a protest, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about people going on the street with slogans and signs. They're not taking anything material from the government or the company or whatever. They're just using their voice, basically, right? In demonstrations, we might intuit, oh, the demonstration is good because it persuades the public. Or we might think the demonstration is good because it persuades the politicians. But there's a lot of very large-scale data on whether protests tend to change public opinion and whether it changes public policy. And the answer is no. We have very little evidence that it has historically done either of those things, basically at any point. And this, if you dig into it, makes sense. Because first of all, governments are usually doing the thing they're doing for very good reasons of their own. Good in the sense of strong rather than good in the sense of moral, right? They are motivated, often in America especially, they're motivated by roughly whatever the top 10% of earners in America want. Because those are their donors. They are not that interested in everyone else, sadly. And if you look at public policy versus opinion, it only correlates with the opinions of the top 10%. They don't, like, it doesn't correlate with the rest of people's opinions. But in any case, the government or the company or whatever you're protesting, they have their own reasons for doing things the way they originally wanted to. And they're not going to change their vision because some people are on the street. It's like asking a focus group what to do for foreign policy. It was just seen as irrelevant, which is painful, by the way. I think it's important to know that many people found meaning and purpose and political formation in protest movements. We'll get to that in a second. So the idea that they are just dismissed by governments is painful, and that's sad. It is sad. And then there's a second thing, which is, okay, but maybe they change public opinion. But there's obviously quite complicated correlation causation question there, because often what's happening is actually the public opinion is changing for lots of complicated reasons, and then the protest is a symptom of that rather than the other way around, right? One of the few cases where sociologists thought, oh, maybe actually the protests are changing public opinion is Black Lives Matter because of, I mean, I could get into the data stuff, but they thought maybe that was what was happening. But even with Black Lives Matter, public opinion went back to the baseline on these issues within a couple of years. It didn't last very long. And for politics, that's a big problem because that's kind of what you're going for, you know? We don't really have good evidence that protests are changing the government's mind or the public's mind. However, they are doing one thing really well, which is they are changing the protesters. People who join protest movements are profoundly changed for life. Their views on politics change from being in that movement, and their lives change. There's actually lots of biographical data on this. People that join protest movements get divorced more often. They choose lower paying jobs. They go back to graduate school, which is a terrible idea. They have fewer children. Like, their whole lives change.
Yeah.
And also their politics changes. And so I always think about protests as a thing that's there to change the protesters. If you were actually to think strategically, what is this for? What does it really do? It changes the protesters. And it's a recruitment tool. You could use it as a recruitment tool, which is why when people I really disagree with, particularly the far right, have protests, one of the number one things to do is go get in the way of that protest so they can't recruit people, right? But yeah, obviously this counters a lot of intuitions that we might have. And, look, I've gone to many a protest, so I feel sad in a way that they don't work the way I used to think they work. But I think it's very important to know this if you want to act strategically in the world. So there's that. And then we can get onto Gaza if you want, because look, you're right. Like, a public opinion has changed on Gaza, which is fascinating to see. And I'm very curious how long that will last, because of course it could be the same as the Black Lives Matter protests. I hope not. I hope people come to recognize the enormous gravity of what has happened there and how complicit the West is in it, among many other things. But my suspicion is that when a good analysis is done, we will not find that it is the protests themselves that have had the impact on public opinion. What I suspect is going on instead is that I think many people who are deeply invested in, well, are deeply opposed to the genocide and are deeply upset by what is happening there are influencing their friends. And I know many people of color, and you can also see data on this and you can see research on this, who see what's happening in Gaza and they say, those are my kids. Like, that's my family. And many of them in particular say, so this could happen to anyone, anywhere now, because now apparently we're happy to just blow up schools full of kids, especially if they're brown, right? There's a kind of personalness, also for some white people, but especially for other people of color, other Muslims and so on. And I suspect that those people have had a strong and slow force on others around them. They have essentially used the force of the social contact hypothesis, which is something I talk about in the book, the sense that I am unequal to you and I care about this, so you should care about it. They've reduced prejudice, let's say, against Palestinians, especially Palestinian civilians, enough that many people have come around. They've come around because they said, wow, my friend is really upset about this. Maybe this really does matter. That's my first pass based on the existing data we have on social movements, on how people come to care about things and so on. If for the first time ever we get data that shows that protests worked on this, amazing. But I suspect it's not what's happened here.
How incredibly fascinating. Thank you for this elaboration. Let's see when the data comes out.
Yeah, let's see. Someone do a research on this, please. Yeah. I'm dependent on data I can't control. But
And in between the lines, you also suggested some other things that, when people get into demonstrations, the experiences, and this brings us back to marketing, where you also see the same thing. So, for instance, when you look at the Heineken Experience Center or the Perrier Museum, you talk about small numbers compared to mass numbers when you talk about to advertising campaigns. But once they experience it, they're much more likely to keep on buying your products, to like your brand even more for the rest of their lives. So let's say the effect is, if you want to call it longitudinal, like on the person in time and not on a lot of people. And there is a very interesting thing here. And so there. And also what I found very fascinating and what we see in your book as well, and related of how it looks like politics and political policy marketing, negativity. So, and how negativity seems to work, and it seems to be, with pain in my heart, I see it seeping into normal marketing. And more and more, tell me a bit more of how does it work?
Okay, great. People often get upset when I say debate doesn't work, which is actually a thing we haven't even gone into that much here. But then they say, but everyone watches so many debates, and that's right. And one of the reasons why is that debate is very good at getting people's attention because it's negativity, and our brains are primed to notice when negativity happens in the social world, that is some form of conflict or disagreement, which makes sense. That's like a good survival instinct, right? If I'm hanging out with a bunch of people and we all have, like, I don't know, access to weapons, it's pretty important whether Martin and Fred are having a disagreement. So our brains will pay attention. And that's why, I don't know if you've been noticing this. I live in a world of like Instagram and TikTok, sadly for me. I make reels, people follow me, blah, blah, blah. And in the last year especially, there's been this quite intense swerve towards people making negative hooks. So the hook is the first 3 seconds of the video where you get people's attention and try to keep them. You probably all know this because you're in advertising, but anyway. And then the hooks have become increasingly negative because people have realized that it's much more compelling rather than saying, here are 10 things I do as a mom. It's way more interesting to be like, here are 10 things I would never do as a mom, right? Or whatever.
No,
yes. The brain is fine for that. Yeah. And honestly, I'm tired now because I go on these platforms, sadly for me, every day, and I look at, okay, what are people up to? What are they doing with this medium? And it's all that now. You can hardly get a normal reel anymore because it's always like 10 secret blah, blah, blah that you shouldn't know, blah, 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 negative, negative, negative. And it's all the same content at the end of the day. It's just how it's packaged, right? But yes, we have a negativity bias psychologically, and we are primed to look for this bit of conflict or things that could generate conflict or things that are controversial. That obviously shapes the way we experience the media world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're thinking deeply. And it might actually just mean that we're incredibly stressed out.
Well,
that we live in a world where everything's really controversial and scary.
Well, based on what you say, what we look at marketing a lot these days is, let's say, how to jog memory structures, that people remember the ads, remember certain. And based on what you say, negativity might jog memory structures stronger. And perhaps that's why, unfortunately, it works. It used to be like 15, 20 years ago, there were not that many negative ads. It's the famous "I'm a Mac" ad. But that was tongue-in-cheek. That was, also interesting. But these days, there's more and more negativity coming in. The sad news is it works, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, it works in one sense, right? It works so that you can short-term get people's attention. But I also think it's a good question whether we even remember it. I often think about a woman who said, there's like a nice saying going around. There was a woman who said she just thinks about her time on social media, not exactly as bad, but as though she was moving grains of rice from one pile to another. It's completely meaningless, right? And then I thought about it and I said, do I remember almost anything I've ever consumed on Instagram? Like almost nothing. Not nothing, but almost nothing. I've spent hours and hours of my life on Instagram. I probably spend like 2 hours a day on it. It's horrible for me. And I don't remember almost anything I've ever consumed, right? And actually most advertising, same way. Like people do not remember it. So the fact that we can short-term get someone's attention doesn't necessarily mean we can long-term change their behavior, either to sell them something or to change their life politically.
Interesting. I think this needs more research. I haven't come across it in the marketing field. And it would be interesting to look at what are the short-term effects and if that translates into long-term effects as well.
Yes.
And perhaps it might just relieve us of all the negativity, but it probably won't.
I'll go back to the point of my book. So my book is actually structured so it says, okay, don't believe in a marketplace of ideas working because that doesn't work. Don't believe in debate. But here are 2 things that really work. Changing people's actions in their life day to day and changing their relationships with other people. Part of the reason that action and relationship changes people's lives is because those are like big structures in their life and those are much more likely to persist. You build an important relationship with someone, it changes the rest of your life. If they're a good friend of yours, if they're your, spouse, right? That's a big deal. And same for certain kinds of actions, especially if you change the infrastructure of people's lives. So this is maybe less relevant to advertising, but not necessarily, because very clever companies, right? They build the whole infrastructure around you and you can never get out of it. Like I'll never not have an iPhone now because everything in my life is structured around iPhone. I mean, that's an infrastructural change. That's the clever advertising thing, right? So I teach activists to say, build people a new infrastructure so they can stop relying on the bad one. But it's very hard work,
Fascinating. I think we're nearing the end of our session here. Okay. So to conclude, you already mentioned it a couple of times. The big questions. How do you effectively convince others?
Yes. What would I say? Okay, look, if you want to convince someone of something very important and big in their life, like what is the good life or what should we do to make the world a better place, then you need to offer them something material that improves their life. And then as they go for that, you need to ask them to also join the movement and own part of it themselves. This is a big thing. Right? And the example I give in my neighborhood is that we have a food co-op. We just bulk purchase food together. So it means that my friend and I went and we knocked on the doors, mostly he did, knocked on the doors of people and said, hey, do you want to order groceries together in bulk and it'll be much cheaper? And we got a bunch of our neighbors together and now we order groceries in bulk. And in addition, we all know each other. Great. That's a very basic organizing tool, but it's already offering someone something material. The people that run this cooperative system more broadly notice that when they do this in like housing estates in the UK, then those people are ready to mobilize for other things. They can resist eviction together. They can help each other in times of like hardship, right? They can, help people when they face medical difficulties. So you need to offer someone something actually materially good and useful for them. And then you bring them around to think about all the other issues involved in like the food system. The food system is completely screwed up in this country and in yours too, I'm sure. It's mostly dominated by a few corporations that force farmers to produce too much produce and then throw a lot of it away, blah, blah, blah. And you can see this when you begin to bulk purchase because suddenly you can get a lot of stuff for really cheap because of this overproduction problem. So you basically bring people together to form relationships with each other and then do something different in the world where they begin to encounter the issue they really care about in a different way. And that's what I'm super interested in. Lots of words can come along with that along the way, but if you just do words, you're not going to get very far because there's some really big, deep stuff that we have to engage in only by engaging in action and relationships with other people. And for the very big ideas, that's what you need.
Super, Sarah. Thank you for this very enlightening session.
Thank you.
This is one of the few sessions that we may actually take another field of research, another field of thinking, and through that different lens, look at your own work in a different way. So thank you for that.
I'm glad you enjoyed it as well. I'm glad you got something out of the book.